Good evening, guys, and welcome back to the Hidebound Convivium. It is Hidecon, and we're going to be doing something a little bit different today, a little bit different than, well, it's not completely different, but it's a change of pace from previous Conviviums. Um, if you've been a follower of the channel for a while, you'll know that our first convivium was on the topic of consumerism, and the second convivium was on the topic of the future of work, specifically in the Western world. And so you'll note that this channel tends to have a wide angle focus. It tends to focus on topics that are a little bit broad strokes, a little bit esoteric or philosophical in nature. But today, I wanted to go ahead and bring more matters of practicality to the channel. And in the interest of doing that, the topic of tonight's discussion is going to be the dissident right in the real world. And to help us facilitate that discussion, I've got two individuals that have been making the rounds in dissident right circles on the internet. To rather intelligent individuals who have put a lot of thought and effort into trying to apply sort of new right or dissident right ideas to the sphere of in person, real world political organizing. And specifically going against strains of thought in the current online right wing sphere that seem to suggest a general retreat from being engaged in politics in general. So I want to go ahead and give those gentlemen an opportunity to introduce themselves, and then I think we'll jump right into the topic. So first, I'm going to go ahead and turn the mic over to Despot Romanicus, as he is known. So Despot, go ahead.
Hello there. I mostly focus on a cynical, political realist analysis of the behavior of power structures in order to figure out how to understand their intentions, what motivates them, and most importantly, how to make one for yourself for your own agendas.
All right, and Despot. Just a note for the audience, and some of them will already be familiar, but Despot is the representative of the so-called despoiler scheme, and the proprietor of a particularly interesting brand of aesthetics. Uh, the I'm going to go ahead and turn it over then to the Right Cafe. He can go ahead and tell us a little bit about himself and about his mission, and then I think we'll dive further into the discussion.
The Right Cafe. I'm the creator of the strategy that's has been sort of ignored by the dissident right for a while, but I'm starting to see some people talk about it. It's called the Enclave strategy, and basically, I made my whole channel just to sort of to get the dissident right or try to convince them to get their shit together. And it's been sort of my goal is to sort of I think the goal of the dissident right, a goal that I share, is sort of getting your I guess either an autonomous region or a nation state that is run by us, and I think that's the only path forward. In my whole strategy is figuring out ways to bring that to fruition. Uh, okay, that's about it.
All right, excellent. So, as these two gentlemen have explained, the sort of topic of tonight's discussion is going to be two distinct approaches to real world political organization that is not just online activism, and it's also not just specifically community building. This would be over and against other strategies such as the so called Tradno state, which I have been known to advocate once or twice on the channel. And other strategies, such as not having a strategy or just a general retreat from politics. It's interesting to note in the context of this discussion that there have been in recent months, new statements issued, ex cathedra by the man himself, Mencius Moldbug, which seem to suggest that the strategy he prefers, and perhaps I'm not interpreting Moldbug correctly here, but in his newer essays, he seems to prefer a strategy of essentially, the idea is that right wing resistance to progressive hegemony is the thing that is sort of generating the oxygen in the room that is fueling the fire of progressive fury, so to speak. And so to disengage from the culture war in general, he seems to suggest, would in essence rob the fight of some of its vigor, so to speak. And perhaps I'm not interpreting him correctly, but that seems to be, as I understand it, the point that he's made in his more recent essays, and that also seems to be a viewpoint that is uh, growing in popularity in dissident right circles, especially as we've seen prominent personalities deplatformed from all kinds of things. Our own personal uh, um, you know, what brain help me speak. But we've had friends, kicked off of Discord, which has been invaluable for the sort of online right wing organization, at least that I've been a part of for a good at least 2 or 3 years. And more people are getting kicked off of YouTube, more people are getting kicked off of Twitter. And as the election season has spun up, it seems, all signs seem to suggest that maybe there is a little bit of a kernel of truth in what Moldbug seems to be suggesting, that a lot of sort of progressive hegemony thrives on the feudal resistance of reactionaries. But our two guests here today are I would think are pushing back on that narrative, or at the very least, I'm going to turn that question over to them. So I'm going to start with Despot, and I'm going to ask him the sort of open-ended question that is, and you can answer this, from your personal opinion or from the standpoint of the system that you're advocating, is that why should people, um, why should people engage in politics? Why should people engage uh, in trying to secure power in order to protect themselves and their communities when it doesn't seem obvious that there is a clear way forward for that kind of activity. And also, it seems like they're going to be facing steeper and steeper resistance that have more and more personal consequences for doing so. And this would apply not only to sort of right wing autists, the people that run in our circles, but also just normal people in general who aren't on board with the affectionately named global homo. So, Despot, if you need me to rephrase the question, I know I went on a little while after I asked it, but basically I'm going to punt that question over to you. Why is pursuing a strategy of disengagement not the way forward?
First things first, it's important to mention that engagement of all types, even things that are not political, is intrinsically a way to power. So even a person who is not actively, voting or actively going to do political action, a person who is simply finding a job or perhaps getting promoted in his job, finding or creating a new business of some kind, is a form of power acquisition in some way. How I see society, which might differ from some people in our circles, is that there is no one ruler. The cathedral, as described by Moldbug, is a large collection of many institutions of power, many of them. Education and the media is often prioritized in some of these interpretations, but who is truly more above the other is always constantly shifting. Different corporations, different federal bureaucracies, different institutions of all kind essentially cooperate and compete with each other all the time to increase their power. And if you look at history, many a times these institutions don't end up creating coherent, great narratives. Oftentimes, they would change narratives, axe certain people, promote certain people and or ideas if it's beneficial for them in a constantly shifting sea. And that's just how I would say power operates. Now, to be detached from the system, from engaging in politics, I believe this makes sense in the context of those who have really bad strategies, those who act like bait for progressives to use to empower themselves, in which if you insist on doing activities that are, let's say, extremely violent, or perhaps activities that would only galvanize the enemy and show how small your side is, then detachment is better than that option. I call this cargo cult politics. Politics where people look at history, they look at the behaviors of successful activists and movements, and assume that the reason why they succeeded was because of the activities they do, not because of the context of their situation, in which it leads for disastrous results. Charlottesville is a famous example of this. So I would say detachment makes sense if your tactics are bad. But if you're trying to find other ways to get power that makes sense from the understanding of how institutions work, then detachment would not be a good idea. Just like how the idea of detaching detaches from bad political activity. But obviously, it doesn't mean you detach from seeking a career or detach from improving your economic situation or from making families or finding other means for you to gain influence that isn't an obvious tool that progressives can use to empower themselves.
Well, thank you, Despot. I had a follow up question that I thought of as I was listening to your response. Um, you know, so this sort of hinges, I think, on people understanding when the activism that they're doing is not particularly beneficial. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a hard ask sometimes for some people for them to be able to have the kind of self awareness to know that what they're doing um, isn't actually benefiting anyone. I think of somebody like yeah, well, these are the kind of people we might call like boomer cons. The people
Mm-hmm.
who, for example, were really into birtherism when that was a big thing, um, and other similar movements like that. And of course, it's difficult because we're in a media ecosystem where it's hard to know just how badly it's like when you have a good PR event, when you have an event that's like that would be good optically, it's very often the case that because of just this complete, blanket media domination by progressive forces, that you never get to capitalize on it because you just don't get your message out there. And then similarly, when you have a blunder that in the grand scheme of things, it's maybe even something that you couldn't have anticipated would go wrong. That you've planned and did everything you could do, but you still had X, Y, or Z didn't go quite right. It seems like in this kind of media ecosystem, um, something like that would just get seized on, you know, to completely discredit your movement. And I don't often defend things like Charlottesville, for example. Um, but there's a lot of things they could have done differently and should have done differently. But I'm not sure that they could have really foreseen the. I believe the young lady's name was Heather Heyer, the one that died.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure they could have really foreseen that, and I'm not sure they could have accurately, understood all the consequences that that they're deciding to rally like that would have, especially back then. I think that was what 2017. Um, I can't remember exactly when Charlottesville was, where it was several years ago, and we've had a few years to sort of mature, and especially I think coronavirus and the pandemic coverage has sort of demonstrated in real time kind of how media consensus operates. It's actually very interesting to watch. Another thing I'd like to my follow up question hasn't actually come yet. I'm sorry, I'm bloviating, but my follow up question is sort of like, Moldbug seems to tie concepts like the cathedral, concepts like Cthulhu always swims left, and all these things. He ties political movement through time into a kind of like system of entropic force,
Mm-hmm.
whereas what the paradigm that I think you're suggesting is more akin to like um, you have basically you have a more atomized or more chaotic understanding of political systems, or I guess a more egoist understanding of political systems, where it's not necessarily that there is some kind of entropic force pulling people in one direction politically or another. It's just that when you have people with access to power pulling in different directions, um, they're going to seize on different ideologies, different belief systems to sort of to perpetuate their power.
Yes,
and
yes.
and and in our current system, um, or like in this current period of time, it just so happens that progressivism is a very effective mimetic tool or mind virus
Mm-hmm.
for power elites to be able to perpetuate. Would you say that's an accurate characterization of your understanding?
To some extent, I would say one of my biggest differences in how I interpret the structures that rule us at this moment is not describing them as entropic, but adaptable. In which, if you look at the history of liberalism since the 1700s, they're essentially they empowered what we call the middle class, the bourgeoisie, away from like the nobility of days past. And how they gain power is always based off of something commercial, something that allows for adaptability in order to foster what is known as creative destruction. In economics, creative destruction is usually when, let's just say for simplicity's sake, old systems are destroyed and replaced with new systems that are better, not morally, not spiritually better, but better at making more money and gaining more power in some way, shape, and form. And so, how I see the world and how I see history, it's always been a fight, a constant and at times irregular fight with many institutions, and often the ones that are best at gaining power wins at the context of their certain time. And they are usually what I refer to as the adaptive power structures. They don't have to be perfectly adaptive, just more adaptive than their rivals. Like if you look at US history, for example, the rise of more franchise for men, because back then only white men who owned land was allowed to vote. But then certain political figures figured that increasing the franchise would be a power acquisition strategy for them. Because after all, if you increase the vote to a group of people, I'm sure they would vote for your side very frequently. Not to mention, as people in society get wealthier, because the economy gets better, in which the institutions that make the economy better would be better in expanding business entities, more trade routes, and so forth, and of course more globalization for more trade, or more imperialism for more conquest for more resources, more people become part of the middle class, more people get power themselves, and this can be used as leverage to essentially tell old fashioned governments to give them more what we call liberal rights because they're able to take it from the powers because they're indispensable to its operation. And of course, many businessmen want good property rights and a state that just won't confiscate their stuff for the sake of good business. Many merchants would want good banks, central banks that standardize currency protected by the state in order so that there's no problem of local currencies being unreliable. All of this and giving more rights to people and so forth are all ways to capture their interests so that they become a useful tool for the structures to perpetuate themselves, in which at this moment, yes, progressivism can fulfill this role.
Okay. Well, I think that's very. I don't know if it's succinctly argued, but it's very, I think, compellingly argued. I do want to go ahead and turn it over to the Right Cafe, and I'm going to pose him the same question that I posed Despot, which is, given this climate of increasing popularity of the idea of detachment from politics and move away from trying to attempt a political solution to the problems we face. Why should people re-engage in politics in your specific prescribed way? So I'm gonna go
Well,
ahead.
first of all, because my method's a lot more covert, the chances of you getting your life ruined, I would say, are a lot lower than if you just do stuff out in the open. Second of all, I've there's oftentimes, even though sort of my means to an end is normally republicanism, if I could keep the U.S. in that state in perpetuity, I would. I'm pragmatic. I don't think we're ever going to get like a reactionary sort of nation state anytime soon. But I actually tend to think a lot of people give up on politics and detach from it because they can't. The political solution is sort of in a maze. There's a maze, and at one end is victory, and the other end is just trying to get your foot out the door. And that maze is very complex, and oftentimes people will give up. And I call this thing the shroud of madness. So basically, people who who cannot find a way out of the maze will at some point either detach from politics altogether or go insane and become incredibly black-pilled. Uh, so yeah, since it's covert, since this is mostly at a state and local level, and it isn't really about it just isn't really ideological in the sense that it's not for some grand Faustian struggle for the survival of our people. It's merely power acquisition done at a local state level. The media usually doesn't report on it because the media isn't going to care if, like, maybe some paleocon who's really a secret neo-reactionary has taken over one of the seats of the county commission of Maricopa County. They just don't have the resources to report on that, especially if it's extremely widespread. Like, imagine if 500 different dissident right wingers got into like state and county governments and flipped several of them. I don't think the media has the resources to report on something that widespread and decentralized. So,
Oh, not to mention, it's also not good for the headlines. Imagine hearing the news neo Nazis do protests against Black Lives Matter. Oh, the clicks the media can make. But then, very vague, boring Republican takes some seat in some rural county somewhere. Not as not as tantalizing. I mean, just recently, I had a friend who tried to run for county commissioner. He didn't win, but his life wasn't ruined, and he at times didn't have the best optics. But again, no one really cared. No big media came in to try to attack him just because he tried to run for county election for very vague and strange hyper-religious viewpoints.
And I will say, as someone who has experience in the field of journalism, who I kind of have a window into that world a little bit. One of the problems that we have with news media in the 21st century, especially print journalism, but this is also somewhat a problem with even TV journalism, is that the sort of focus area for news coverage is increasingly national. And now even local news outlets, they're devoting increasingly more time and pages to covering national news events and writing like really annoying preeny op-ed columns and essentially the the sort of the progressive apparatchiks that run media institutions have bought all in on a kind of nationalized, sort of totalizing media culture that I think it makes it like as both of you have suggested, they don't have the resources to cover a lot of these local events. A lot of times because they don't want to, and they don't see the significance of these events because they think as long as they have, I think in large part, they think as long as they have the ability to command eyeballs on these national culture issues, that they're doing more good for both their bottom line and for their sort of cultural pet projects, than if they were to cover, say, like you said, if a weird city councilor gets voted in Maricopa County. So yeah, I think both of you are correct in the sense that, and this is a commonality that both of your systems bring to the table, is that really what you're talking about is you're talking about events that are, you're talking about activism and political activity that is not, it's not illegal, it's not shadowy, it's not shady, it's just not public. There's a difference between what is public per se, and especially what is nationally, what has a national profile, and what is just merely, what are just the day to day operations of state and municipal government. Like even me myself, like I said, I have a background in journalism. I'm relatively well informed. I don't know who my state senators are, and most people don't either. And that's like a universalizable thing in the United States. Um, so if you wanted to have a quick rebuttal, the right cafe, you can. Otherwise, we can move on to other questions.
I think that's good. We can move on to another question.
Okay, but just to summarize, I think you would both agree that you know why people should buy into being active in politics in these specific, localized and prescribed ways, is that there's a lot of fear mongering out there about you will have your life ruined if you're a based person who does politics, and that kind of hyperbolic rhetoric is simply not true.
Yes, I
Yeah,
agree. And the thing is, or even if also you can even run at a national level. I mean, I would recommend it as long as you're able to hide your power level. But I prefer to keep as low of a profile as possible. You know.
I've even seen like groups that are more openly, let's say, their ideological heritage is closer to the old 2016 alt-right, and they're trying to do like miniature protests here and there, and no national outrage. Sure, no local news can hate them. It's not because what they're doing is good or effective. It's just that I can't help but feel most of our extreme fear can result into two things. Number one, the 2016 alt-right was heavily used by the media. But historically, extremist groups, even of the strangest kinds, don't usually get that spotlight so normally because they were using them for their own agenda. And secondly, many of us are very online. And so naturally, in the online world, even though the distances are so big, it's considerably easier for some administrator in YouTube and Discord to censor someone saying some things they consider hateful without, spending so much resources or causing quite a fuss. So in a way, our experiences online make it feel like we're trapped, but it's just easier to police certain online spheres such as YouTube or Discord. But and local politics, that might not necessarily be the case.
I think that's a great point, Despot. I'm glad you brought that up. Um, so I know this is kind of a hard and graceless segue into our next question, but and this question is especially relevant for Despot, and I know he'll probably think this is kind of an unfair question. At least I get the sense he probably would, just based on our previous conversations on the topic. But given that both of your understandings of politics and both of your aspirations in politics for the dissident right can be, in some sense, characterized as Machiavellian. Now, I know that saying things are Machiavellian is like a misnomer, and it's like the most annoying thing you could do in political theory is talk about things being Machiavellian, but everybody, I think, understands what I mean by the term. And there is a concern because there's always been tension between what a lot of people are tempted to see as the very practical, very realist advice of somebody like Niccolo Machiavelli or somebody influenced by him. They see the political utility of that kind of an understanding of the world. At the same time, a lot of people in these circles are uh, deeply devout, or if not devout, at least practicing Christians. And Christianity, in some sense, is a little bit more idealistic in its aspirations. Now, you can say that yet there's a harmony between a lot of aspects of sort of cynical realist understanding of politics and Christianity, because after all, Christianity does posit original sin. It doesn't say that people are angels or whatever. But at the same time, being involved in politics, oftentimes people with sincere religious convictions feel like their involvement in politics, especially if they're involved in something somewhat dubious, is morally corrupting them as a person. So, Despot, I feel like you fielded this objection probably more than the Right Cafe has.
Hmm.
Just
Yeah,
because
that's right.
I think your rhetoric is a little bit stronger. But I want you to go ahead and answer the question. How can someone with a deeply traditional faith and moral understanding participate in the quote unquote despoiler scheme?
That's very simple. I would say that the best way to not be corrupted by power is to understand it more. Because the majority of what people imagine when it comes to power corrupting you is usually in situations where you're put in a hazardous situation, in which, on one end, don't get power, on another end, you have to do something that would be considered immoral. One famous example would be in order to win elections in a certain area, you have to tone down your religious rhetoric or something like that. Or to make as much money in business as possible, you might have to do business with groups that are simply, well, not on our side, let's just say. And I can understand those concerns. So people have a fear of compromise of some sense. But I would have to say that so called Machiavellian politics or political realism is universal in practically every sphere in some form. How extreme it is actually variable. For example, workplace politics is an example of something that can be described as Machiavellian. Co-workers working with each other to convince the bosses to do certain things, or certain factions of workers from different departments wanting a larger budget for themselves. Things like that always happens. It's usually just about finding leverage and using it. Essentially, if you simply understand power more and you can creatively utilize it, you can think of ways that can get you power and at the same time without compromising the things you hold dear. In fact, I specifically designed a spoiler scheme to do that, to defend your ideas. And I'll explain it later when it's time to explain it. But in regards to the church, I mean, have you seen Vatican politics? The politics cardinals and bishops have with each other, not just in the past, but maybe even now, and especially the things that they find themselves prioritizing out of necessity, not necessarily out of ill will. Especially if you're a bishop, you have to make sure the diocese keeps on running so that people get their sacraments. So the day-to-day operation of the diocese and whatever benefits it to expand its operation as best as you can in an ever so hostile liberal world, you can't really blame him for having so much pressure, and he has to be savvy in understanding how to get the things he needs to get things operating. So, to an extent, I think people are kind of misunderstanding Machiavellian politics and the word itself. Simply seeing the world as it is and working with the reality does not necessarily mean you have to become evil. Heck, even strategies that are overtly as wrong as possible in fact may be disadvantageous many times.
I understand that, but I would push back a little bit, especially when you mention, like, Vatican politics, for example. A lot of, I'm Catholic myself, and I wouldn't say that, like, you know, um, Renaissance Vatican politics was necessarily morally good or morally desirable, or a system that we ought to perpetuate. The whole idea that, like, you would go up with money to bribe cardinals at the conclave um, is we, like, a lot of Catholics would say that's abhorrent, and we shouldn't engage in that kind of activity. So you can say, oh well, it happens, but there's a difference between saying, oh, this thing happens and this thing is right and we should perpetuate it. You see what I
And
mean?
interestingly, if you want to stop certain forms of corruption, one must also utilize some forms of power to stop it. So it becomes this vicious cycle. In the Renaissance era, the church was more powerful. It had more material wealth. It had more state power. So naturally, more games of power would attract to it. In fact, simony was a common sin in the past, where people would not only purchase sacraments, which was quite unnecessary, I guess, but most importantly, purchase church offices. It doesn't really happen today. Because why would any person seeking power purchase a church office now? So, in a way, how what I would say is if we want a society where the church is more powerful and has more influence, stuff like that has a higher probability of occurring. And to in fact prevent it as best as you can, you must understand power more in some way, shape, and form. In a way, it's like the idea behind society and violence or governments and war. There will always be the possibility of war, and sometimes your enemy would have deadly weapons, which means the best course of action you can do is to not only arm yourself, but also be wise, be creative, and think of ways to minimize the probability where you put yourself and others in a hostile moral situations, which requires good savvy thinking in and of itself.
Yeah, in some sense, I agree, and I think a lot of times people, especially nowadays, are in some sense because a lot of people, especially right wingers, are isolated from power. They're able to construct these sort of sterile ideological environments for themselves that I think don't really survive first contact with the outside world, so to speak. And so they're disappointed when the operation of real world politics is not, cannot be subjected to formulaic understandings of how to conduct yourself morally in the political sphere. Um, in some sense, it's not that people are not it's it it's not so much a problem that people are not willing to compromise, not compromise, but moderate their zealotry in terms of their moral beliefs. It's more just that people, I think, have unrealistic expectations of how well they can achieve the kind of ideological and moral purity that they're attempting.
Hmm.
But I'll go ahead and turn it over to the right cafe. And this is probably not a criticism that you'd probably be intended to deal with. But nevertheless, I mean, people could ask things like, is it. And I will understand a little bit more of this question when we get into your we let you take the mic, right cafe. But people might ask, like, is it moral for me to come in and carpetbag a random county and make it based and red pilled when I'm not from there, I don't know anybody there, and I'm just some random guy that comes in and starts getting me and my buddies on the city council.
Thing is, I the part of the strategy is not it. Well, first of all, that is not. It's. I don't think there's a high chance that this county council will be flipped with a composition entirely of foreigners. I think as a way to sort of not become carpetbaggers. Because I don't have respect for people who move to other states just to mess up their politics, provided their politics aren't the ones that I have. But
An important caveat, right? It's okay when I do it.
But like, I would assume just to be somewhat honorable, I would have some people who live in the area, and try to collaborate with them. I would attempt to have so many connections that I basically have people to work with in pretty much just about every state, and that takes a lot of time. But like, the dissident right in America, I'd say, is made up of about 100,000 people. There's probably people in the dissident right in just about every large center or metro in the world. The question is, are they willing to actually go ahead and do what I want them to? And I don't think my main concern about this morally is less to do with the sort of foreign carpetbaggers being rootless cosmopolitans, and more about sort of like your personality changing as you uh, become more and more power hungry and more like sort of the elites who you despise. You become less like stewards of beacons of light and more like despots. A subtle jab at despot, but
Well, I mean, this is a well established literary trope for good reason, because it's also just a trope in reality. Is that you have the bright eyed, bushy tailed young guys that get in, they want to change the world, they want to fix the system, and they become part of the system. You get the the fiery anti-corruption senator who goes to Washington, and within a few years he's telling Jimmy Stewart that he's got to sign the bill. You know what I mean? Uh, so yeah, there's always, but I mean that's always going to be a problem just in general. Like this is just a general problem with people, and I think this is another point I want to make before we move on to our next question. Is that a lot of times I think it's motivated. If I'm honest, I think it's motivated a lot from a kind of laziness, and myself included, because I'm lazy. But in some sense, it's like somebody will stand up in these in the right wing circles that we travel in and be like, okay, here's our idea, here's how we're gonna do something tangible, and people just raise like the most. In some sense, people raise objections to things that are just like, well, what if the people who do that become bad? And it's like that's just a generalized it's like a generalized critique that you could apply to literally anything, and it only serves to basically suck air out of the room, um, because basically any practical plan, and this just doesn't even have anything to do with politics. It's just about when you try to do anything in general. If you want to build a house, and people can be like, well, what if the roof of the house collapses in 10 years? And it's like, well, uh, in some sense, I think a lot of people, and this is maybe the more fertile point for discussion, is that a lot of people in the dissident right are so risk averse, because I think as a society we are in general very risk averse, that these sort of generalized objections of, well, what if it just goes bad, seem to carry a lot of weight, when in reality there's not a lot of substance to them as a critique. Um,
Yep. I always like to tell people who may have such critiques that what they should be seeking is what would be referred to as favorable statistical outcomes, or high probabilities of something that you want to happen. Since after all, power and getting it and trying to avoid others from taking it from you is a numbers game in some way, shape, and form, and that's just a reality you have to accept. Nothing is perfect, and that rule applies to your enemy as well.
That's a good point to make as well. It's very often the case that people treat the progressive movement as a kind of like force of nature or a leviathan. I mean, that's implicitly what the language of Moldbug's Cathedral, I think, does. Is it in some sense it does treat the progressive movement as a kind of force of nature. And so, in some sense, people who I think internalize a lot of Moldbug come away feeling like fighting progressivism is like spitting into the wind, or trying to tie down sunlight.
Indeed. I'm trying to, instead of trying to change that language, one thing I'm trying to do is to explain to them that every institution is like a cosmic horror entity. It really, truly doesn't care about you. The larger it is, the more the people on top, their biggest care would be, let's say, the profits for a corporation, how a certain policy affects an area or constituency. In the end, every very big institution just doesn't have the capability to truly feel for an individual. And so they're all eldritch abominations.
It's an interesting point. The Right Cafe. Did you have anything to add, or?
Not really. I have to talk to somebody a little bit, so I'm sort of trying to rush it along.
Oh, okay. Um, well, then let's go ahead and touch on. Well, I think we've already really touched on aspects of like optics, and I think questions of like sort of the systemic problems posed to your given systems are things that are better addressed in sort of your general overviews. So the last question I want to hit before you guys sort of give your general overviews of your system and before we head out is basically what are you guys personally up to right now in terms of trying to get your preferred means of power acquisition off the ground. So we'll cut to Despot first, and then the Right Cafe, and then
Uh,
I think um, for the sort of nutshell of you guys' particular strategies, we'll actually flip the order.
so for me, other than sharing the idea as best as I can, the spoiler scheme as an organization is meant to be started locally. So as soon as the corona apocalypse ends, and some stable job I find with my particular skill set, which may require that I move to a new locality, as soon as that occurs, I would love to incorporate my organization and immediately begin trying to do what my organization says it would try to do. And that would depend, we'll explain what the system is after. But generally, exactly what I'm doing now is improving the skills of my particular trade in order to increase my likelihood to obtain a stable career in it after the coronavirus lockdowns have ended.
Okay, so a question of practicality. The Right Cafe. One of the things I did want to ask you about is that I feel like you've done a lot of research on because I feel like watching your videos, like your ability to just smack me over the head with this county and this county and this county has got this many commissioners and da 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 da. It's like it's so detailed, and you've got basically, like how much energy are you putting into research, and
I'd say roughly about an hour or two each day. And this is a bit of a lesser component of it, but I'm trying to get back into contact. I haven't talked to him in a while, my state rep and former state senator, because I live in a blue county, but my sort of district is a red area. So I know this, my whole focus was on counties, but to start out, I'm trying to get political experience probably as a state rep before I get on a stable career and start becoming a rootless cosmopolitan, just moving place to place until I find a place that I can sort of set up shop for political opportunism. But yeah, I do research about an hour or two every day.
Okay, and I think that's incredibly to your credit, and it shows because I think one of the main points that you raise in your videos is that a lot of right wingers just think, oh, the cities are gone. There's just something magical about having lots of buildings in close proximity that it just makes people blue-haired feminists. And what I think your videos tend to demonstrate is that this is actually not the case. That while it, correlation, causation, blah blah blah, but the point still remains that you can't just give up the cities, and B, if you really dug in and you really did your research and you actually made an attempt to figure out what the game on the ground was, then you would know that it's actually not as hopeless as it seems. So that's the
Yeah, I don't know if it's possible to sort of stream video, but I'm right now looking at the directory of right wing enclaves, and I have like I have like 50 different counties and stuff, and it has like their budget, their how some of their the amount of people in them, their partisan slants, and commissioner breakup. That took me like probably 10 hours to make. Okay, not 10, maybe like 4 or 5, but like
Perhaps you can share me some of that information as well.
yes, I will, but
oh no.
But anyway,
I would love to get
when
that.
people say people, a lot of the citizen right seems to be very autistic about when it comes to like the major economic centers of commerce, and they sort of view having power as a corruptive thing that will make you an agent of Za, when really it isn't. It isn't really the case. I'm not going to say like the majority of large cities are left leaning, but like I'd say 20 to 30% of them aren't, and we can't just abandon them because they're the exception.
Well,
And
yeah, I think it's also helpful to point out that's like there are neighborhoods in cities. There are, in some sense, like a city, it's like, oh, a city may be solidly blue, but like 40% of the electorate in the city is not,
yeah,
or
and that's why I included some light blue cities, like for example, Orange County, California. I think I think that just in the right, one of the issues that they sort of view it as a hopeless game. They sort of view the system as like an unstoppable juggernaut of death, and they view themselves as an ant. When really, it's more like a truck versus a bicycle. Um, you can steer out of the way if you're careful enough. While if you're an ant, you just get crushed.
well, and there is an angle that I think, to be fair to a lot of people, there is an angle that gets brought up, which is the demographic angle. That, new immigrant communities tend to be, tend to swing Democrat. That young demographics of younger people tend to swing Democrat by wide margins, and they see that these demographics are key demographics going forward electorally in the future. Although I think they tend to picture. I think they tend to picture like I don't know, like a wave of Somali immigrants just washes over the country when that's not exactly how it works. Although,
Now I'm actually looking at there's a really good topic I found, or Census Gov. It sort of like talks about the different demographics of the United States, and apparently I actually think Castizo futurism might save us in the long run. You don't know. I'll probably explain it on the main video, but basically I was looking at the white alone percentage, and actually between 2010 and 2019 it went up according to estimates. Went up by a point. Went up from roughly that 75 to 76% white alone. I think I really hate when people are like, "Oh, America's late 56." No, it's not. It's roughly in the mid 70s. And I think if you wanted to like if you wanted to like rig the demographic game, what you probably could do is you could probably shift the source of immigration to like South America. Um, but I'll get to that later. In the main video, that will take a while to.
From my point, I would say that the spoiler schemes as a structure, which we'll, I guess, explain much later, isn't so dependent on ethnicities, where it has a more expansive way of controlling individual subjects.
okay.
Of course, and also with sort of Castiza futurism, I guess if they move up north to Canada, settlers will be pretty happy.
Okay.
You heard it here first, guys. That Castizos are going to be the saviors of America and possibly Canada. Um, but I'll go ahead and I wanted to go ahead and give the Right Cafe the mic first because he's been going second the whole time. So I wanted to go ahead and let him explain, give the nutshell explanation of the Enclave strategy for the people at home watching. And so, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to him.
Okay, so first of all, I'm going to read the fundamental assumptions piece of the Enclave strategy. It's roughly about a paragraph or so. The Enclave strategy recognizes that community building from the ground up requires money, security, and political recognition. If you don't have political recognition, if you're not a subdivision of any sort of county, state, province, you don't have any security, therefore you can get Waco'd. Building a trad village from scratch will likely be impossible if the goal is to keep it demographically and religiously set sort of the way you want it to be in perpetuity. Because you can't have freedom of association is a dead thing. It's been dead since the 60s. The military would be sent in if you attempt to make a Catholic village because of the Civil Rights Act, provided people who aren't Catholic and aren't, well, European or barred from moving there. The Enclave strategy is not a strategy that involves making new communities, but instead taking over and reshaping the culture and politics of political subdivisions, such as counties, parishes, cities, and states, as well as using taxpayer resources to slowly and subtly change the culture of those areas. This is also because large counties and states, regardless of size, have security. They will not be destroyed by the military, and they have infinitely more economic power. I'd rather, and even just a small town, I'd rather be the mayor of a town that's officially recognized by some level of government than live in a city of 1 million people that is unrecognized and can get Waco'd at any time. Also, while politics is downstream from culture, the state can sponsor institutions that slowly change culture, unless the Enclave strategy seeks to do exactly that, albeit at a level where it tends to fly under the radar. Oh, looks like a Despot's going to be AFK, so guess we can have a discussion, you and me, Icon.
Is Despot AFK? Is that what he said?
He said he'll be AFK for a few minutes.
Oh, okay, excellent. I don't know. Quite frankly, one of the questions that I had was, and I mean, I take your point. I take your point about being Waco'd. An important part of not being Waco'd is basically, like you said, having political recognition, right? Like the main difference between like David Koresh Town and the town from Footloose is there's a degree of like, obviously David Koresh is a little bit crazier than the Footloose people, but like, you would never imagine that like Footloose Town would get Waco'd, just by virtue of it is an established political entity, even though it has like significant influence of the city government by people, not religious fanatics, but people with strongly held religious convictions. In my own state of Tennessee, actually, I know of this town in West Tennessee where they have a college that's run by the Church of Christ called Freed Hardeman University, and because of the economic power of the college, the Church of Christ, the elders at the Church of Christ, have essentially been able to exercise a considerable amount of political power within the town itself, the town of Henderson in Tennessee. They were able to, for example, convince the town, if I recall correctly, they were able to convince the town to sell them the movie theater that was directly across the street from the college, that they then incorporated as part of the college and turned it into a theater specifically for students only and closed it to the public. So while that is kind of scummy, I think it sort of illustrates in general the overall desirableness and viability of like you said, like your enclave strategy over and against the Tradno state idea that has been floating around, which, frankly, I'm partial to the Tradno state, but it's primarily for, I think, romantic reasons. This is why I don't think I'm a very good politician or anybody that would really be desirable to have in a political capacity, just because I'm overly idealistic and romantic about things. Um, but I don't know. Would you say something like that perhaps is an example of an enclave strategy done successfully, where, for example, you might have a religious college that, because of the effect of the college on the commercial success of the community, you're able to exercise more and more political power?
Yes, and the thing is, actually, in the enclave strategy at a state level, I've actually proposed constructing new land grant based universities, some of which could be have the faculty which are highly religious. And the idea is you could basically construct them in like sort of a medium size, maybe a couple 100,000 people county that's blue, or just shitlib. Not like shitlib, but like okay, barely blue, like near swing state tier. And then you build a religious college over using taxpayer revenue, and all of a sudden, the sort of monastery effect causes it to become a solid red county. Uh, but yeah, I would say that's sort of a successful example of it. Speaking of Tennessee, the example that I'd like to bring up would be Knox County. Have you heard of it?
Knox County would be Knoxville, correct?
Yeah. It has roughly about. Let me check the census. Has roughly about 470,000 people. If the dissident right took that over and took the count, they could probably have a bit of money that they could use to like with taxpayer resources to fund some local pet projects. And this probably the media wouldn't pick up on it. They might, although I don't think it will get at a national level, because really that's kind of boring, as we said.
Well,
Oh,
yeah,
and the U.S. government wouldn't send in fighter jets to freaking destroy it, you know?
yeah. I don't imagine the National Guard getting called up to sack Knoxville anytime soon. And to illustrate,
If they did, it would backfire horribly in terms of like public opinion.
right? Well, to illustrate your point, for example, like, so our last governor was Bill Haslam, and he was the mayor of Knoxville. And during his tenure as mayor, I think he was mayor of the city, or he was mayor of the I think he was mayor of the city. So there was a Volkswagen plant in Knoxville, and I don't remember the details especially well, but basically he was involved in breaking up a union that they were going to form um, at the Volkswagen plant. Um, to make sure that the plant stayed in the area, and something like that, like you would think ideologically, and just in terms of what this would mean on like a social level, you would think that something like that would be a really interesting story that somebody like the New York Times would want to cover, like union busting in America, but you know that never got covered, to my knowledge, in the national press. Whereas what does get covered in the national press is some lady, uh, saying she's going to call the cops on a black dude for threatening her dog. Um, so yeah, I think that that in a nutshell kind of demonstrates sort of media myopia and the way that we can use that to our advantage, perhaps.
Very well, Despot. You're back,
Let,
right?
yes. Let me read off what the despoiler scheme is and its fundamentals.
Oh,
The,
wonderful.
dis- the despoiler scheme as a strategy is designed to capture the material interests of those who participate in it to serve the agenda of its leader. How it operates is simple. The founder and executive director of a despoiler scheme, known as the despoiler, recruits individuals to become its beneficiaries. The spoiler and his beneficiaries work to lobby, starting with local governments, be it in a city council or county commission, to subsidize the scheme by passing laws that the spoiler himself wrote. The politicians are then rewarded by obtaining the favor of the despoiler, who would relay to his beneficiaries which to vote for and generally support an election day or provide some other useful assistance. The despoiler takes the wealth obtained from subsidies to reward beneficiaries, where the ones who fought for the scheme the hardest in the eyes of the despoiler shall receive more spoils. The distribution of spoils would likely be through providing personal grants for social welfare purposes or hiring beneficiaries to work as sinecures for a short amount of time. It is a feedback loop where each of the three players have an incentive to keep this machine spinning, and the despoiler has the privilege of deciding how exactly it would spin, where it would spin, and how it would look like when it spins, to essentially just accumulate power like an institution, a monstrous institution, and using that leverage however he wants to essentially create a hegemony where he can try to influence local politics and larger to move closer to what he would want. The fundamentals of how I see my strategy is I always start with the basic question: motivation. How do you get people to do things? How do you get your leaders to care? Because I notice that even from dissident right groups who are very optimistic and want to do something, their motivation eventually tapers. It can only be so far before people start caring about other things. Many progressives, they turn their activism into a job if they're really devoted. Many right-wingers, they move away from anything related to activism to start to get a career and make a family. I thought to myself, the only way, and I'm sure Right Cafe can agree in some sense, the only way to ensure that people care more about these political changes is if they have direct benefit in some way and become some kind of reliable paying job of some form. In which, in this case, the spoiler scheme has a strong advantage because the spoiler scheme structure allows the spoiler to control the incentives and the distribution of the incentives to his many beneficiaries. He can essentially pressure them to be either uncaring or be ever more sycophantic to whatever his mission is for the purpose of obtaining their easy passive income.
All right. Are we good, Despot, or is there more?
Yeah, those are fundamentals, and you can ask any more questions specifically because it's quite a flexible entity.
Okay. Well, we've ran for an hour and about 7 minutes now, so I think that's probably a good length for the preliminary discussion. Especially, we don't want this to run any longer than the actual discussion. I think one of the main takeaways that I wanted to highlight from this discussion was the idea that you know you guys in some sense, your two fundamental ways of looking at power, your two fundamental ways of trying to help the dissident right navigate the vagaries of political power, actually they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. And I foresee there being a kind of synergy between the two of you guys and you guys' ideas and the way that they would play out in the real world. So that's
Indeed, if you see things, it's actually a holdover from hyper ideological thinking where people see certain things as really contradictory to each other. But in the world of pure strategy, they can happily mesh, work together, use each other's principles, and so forth.
yeah, I agree. And that's I think something I'm going to highlight in the sort of main event discussion, which is going to be the sort of ne plus ultra of dissident right political strategy roundtables, so to speak. So, on the topic of that, um, I want to sort of introduce the main discussion that's going to be taking place sometime in September. And there will be more announcements about it on the channel as we get closer. But in essence, I've devoted this channel specifically to this discussion for the next few weeks. So, in general, um, the information I want to provide the audience is this. that there will be, in probably towards the middle of September, a roundtable discussion that will feature myself, Despot, the Right Cafe, and it will also feature other individuals from the Canis Society or other individuals who, well, no, I think they'll all be from the Canis Society, but people who have traveled in the same sort of circles, people who have been reading the Enclave strategy and watching the videos, people who've been reading the Despoilers strategy and been talking to Despot. So people who have a lot of familiarity with these ideas are going to be joining us for a sort of roundtable discussion where hopefully we can really get down to brass tacks, we can nail down specifics, and hopefully we can potentially even set up some communication networks for sort of furthering the actual application of these ideas. The sort of the main difference that this is going to have from other conviviums is going to be that this will actually be a live streamed event. People will be able to essentially call in, or not call in, they'll be able to type in the chat with their questions, and we'll have a considerable Q&A session, and that will be sort of the debut of live streamed conviviums on this channel. And I couldn't think of anything better and more appropriate to do that with than this particular discussion, which is in my opinion, probably the most important discussion that's taking place on the dissident right. Is that some people are interested in disengaging, but at the end of the day, there has to be, at the very least, some kind of rearguard action. And what shape is that going to take, and how are we going to make that happen? Especially, as most of us, I think all three of us in this discussion are young men who don't, a lot of the achievements that we've made in our life, we don't have many. We've got a clear tombstone, so to speak, right now. And so, what kinds of missions are we going to devote considerable chunks of our lives to? That's really the question that's facing us today and as a community. And so I think that political organization is a very real part of that. So anyway, that's the sort of rundown of the main discussion that's going to be taking place later on. And more videos will come out later, sort of explaining, and hopefully there will be an announcement out a week in advance so that you guys will know when and what day to tune in. I'm going to go ahead and let you guys make your closing remarks, and then I think we'll go ahead and end our discussion for tonight. So we'll start with the Right Cafe. Do you have any closing remarks?
We are the future stewards of the Western world.
Yes, we are. Despot?
All I have to say, confront, adapt, evolve. After all, that is I would say, the hidden motto of the neoliberal system as well.
All right, improvise, adapt, overcome. Got it. Thank you guys so much for joining me tonight. It was a pleasure and a privilege to have you both, and I hope to see you again. We'll be in contact, obviously, but I hope to see you again in September, where we can finish out our discussion in more detail. So
No problem. No problem.
Thank you. Thank you guys
You're
for
welcome.
joining me, and thank you as the audience for tuning in. This has been the Hidebound Convivium. Good night and God bless.